I have been given many names over centuries: brother, blade, remnant, oath, but none of them settled as deep as the thing that wakes now beneath my ceramite. A small, stubborn memory that refuses the doctrine and the discipline and the sanction for getting. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. It presses against my ribs like a trapped breath, a human ache folded into the machine of my body, and it arrives on the eve of the sleep every space marine calls holy. The final sleep within the sarcophagus where men become legend or whisper into darkness. And so I write this for no tribunal and no chapel, but for the quiet of my own mind as I prepare to let the coffin close. The armor is busy with ceremonial hums and the quiet clicks of servo-servitors rearranging straps and sealing seals. Men move in rituals designed to turn fear into statue, and outside the armory the world keeps its indifferent clatter. Inside, under plates of temper-hardened ceramite and the slow thud of a heart tuned by gene sculpting and prayer, I feel the boy I tried to unmake. He is thinner than I remember, sleeves too long over his elbows, hair dusted with the coal smell of the settlement where I was born, knees cracked, hands scarred by a life that had no grandeur, hands that learned to cradle bread rather than hold bolters. I was told at the first ritual to fold that boy away and replace him with oath and ordinance, to let the chapter's hunger for efficiency excise the pointless, soft things that would only weigh a battle brother down. I obeyed. Obedience is a craft taught as cleanly as marksmanship. One learns to trade the private for the public, the touch of mother for the touch of a garrison hand. But memory is a sly thing. It hides in the seams, in the hollow beneath a sleeve, in the ghosted taste of a stew that no longer nourishes the way a home stew did. Tonight, as I lie within linens woven with the sigils of my chapter and feel the sarcophagus, lid breathe the scent of cold metal, that boy presses his forehead to the inside of my skull and asks for one small mercy: to be remembered. I had believed for so long that to be a space marine meant the eradication of longing, each desire trimmed by discipline, each hesitation overwritten by doctrine. I learned to carry the weight of galaxies like a shield, and to bury the soft, shamming things that spoke of a life that had not been sanctioned by banners. Yet here in the hush before the final hush, those soft things are loud with clarity. I remember the sound of my father's voice, gravelly, patient, telling me that a man must work with his hands if he wishes to feed hope to his children. And I remember the smell of rain on iron where we worked, how small miracles were made from saving a single day's harvest. These are not heroic memories. They are inefficient, embarrassing, and utterly human. They have been declared surplus by the chapter's surgeons and theological review, yet they return with the persistence of roots pushing through stone. I do not tell these things to boast. I tell them because the secret of what makes us still human is not only the great deeds chiseled into monoliths, but the tiny failures, the soft grafts of tenderness we were taught to think of as weakness. There is a particular image lodged between my shoulder blades tonight, a thin, warm lantern swung by a child's small hand as we marched past the ruin of a shrine that had once given the settlement comfort. The child's grin was an act of defiance, and the grin lodged in me like a hot coal that would not be stamped out. I recall an oath I swore to that small face, an oath I could never keep at the time because war took me and duty braided me into steel. But the promise lived, small and obedient, inside the folds of my conscience. That promise, more than creed, haunts me now. In the long years between that knocking and this closing, I have been a vessel for the chapter's tragedies and triumphs, a blade that has sung its own war song for centuries. I have known victory that tasted like ash and honor that cut like frost. I have held the hand of a brother whose eyes had forgotten how to see the dawn. Yet the boy remains, patient and asking for nothing more than to be touched by memory before the fossil of my life sets. This is not a plea against my calling. The Emperor and my chapter have my obedience still. It is rather a quiet request that those who come after remember the small things I could not admit to myself while the armor pressed tight. The first song that taught me to hum when fear paralyzed my limbs. The brittle laugh that followed a cowardly retreat and felt like forgiveness. The sticky fingers of a sister whose face I cannot now recall clearly but whose warmth shapes the jaw of my solitude. There is shame in this confession because a space marine is meant to be an icon, not a confessor. I could read the litany of honors and recite the battles by their tactical nodes, yet none of those laurels will soften the quiet want in my chest that has peopled this hour with simple recollections. As the carapace cools and the servitors whisper the last checks, I let the boy speak again, not with words but with the weight of being. An image of him lying beneath a lean roof, fingers splayed on a crate as he naps, the small dust motes catching the sun like a congregation of tiny saints. I press back, with the discipline that has kept me whole through centuries of carnage, and I let these images be both my sacrament and my sin. There is a saying among my brothers that death in service is the most honorable sleep, that the sarcophagus is a cradle and the throne above is a lamp. Tonight I do not quarrel with that geometry of faith. What I do insist on, softly, and with the stubbornness of human marrow, is this: that the final record of me not be only a string of campaign honors and skull tallies. Somewhere deep in the registry of my chapter, there should be room for a child's grin and a father's soot-streaked hand. It is a small request and perhaps a foolish one, but it is the last I can make before silence. The machine hums its liturgy. My fingers, thick with augmetic graft, fumble a moment as sarcophagus clamps descend, and in that brief interval I offer the memory into the dark, allowing it to slip like a bright thing under the lid, where it will warm the cold for however long memory endures. If the chapter chooses to remember only banners, let it be so. If the emperor chooses to count only oaths, then I bow. But in the sarcophagus, closing breath, I tuck this secret in my throat like a seed, and in the quiet that follows, I let myself be claimed by sleep, not as legend only, but as the man who once loved a ruined world enough to promise a child a better morning. They told me to forget the world that birthed me as if forgetting were a clean act, a surgical excision performed in sterile halls beneath hymn-lit arches. But memory is not tissue that can be removed without pain. It is the marrow that stills a man's step when he stands on a ruined bridge and remembers the first time he fell as a child. And so, as the sarcophagus warms around me and the seals whisper their obedience, the boy I folded away returns in a rush of small, ordinary things I was taught to call unbecoming. I remember the settlement first not as a ruin or a feature on a tactical map, but as a breathing place of small economies, a well-worn kettle blackened by endless fires, the crooked bench where a neighbor carved toys from scrap, the cant of a roof that sheltered 3 families and their private collapses of grief. There was laughter there too, thin, sudden laughter that snapped like a twig when seasons pooled tidewater into the gutters. But above everything, the air tasted of iron and old bread, of work that greased your hands so you could sleep easier, and those textures press against the inside of my armored ribs now with a clarity I have never given myself permission to hold. I was hungry then in the manner of children everywhere, an itch under the tongue, an impatience for the next warm thing, and sometimes hunger taught me cunning rather than shame. How to hollow a loaf in the night and fill it with small fines, how to barter a favor for a scrap of cheese, how to watch a mother wash a bowl and know the economy of kindness. My father's hands were a ledger I learned to read. The callus at the thumb meant a week of extra labor. The faint scar across the palm meant a season when machines misbehaved and men cursed. But he was patient, a man who taught me the ritual of mending, that a broken thing need not be cast out if so many hands hold it with care. There was a sister once, small and narrow-eyed, who would press her face into my shoulder when thunder came and hum a tune that had nothing to do with doctrine. I cannot summon her name cleanly. Names in the chapter are often reduced to honorifics or numbers, and those small private syllables are the first to rot when public memory consumes the private. But I can summon the shape of her hand in the dark, the way her fingers closed with the desperate tenderness of someone who knows how precarious childhood is on a world that asks for sacrifice too soon. When the recruiters came, pale-faced, efficient, saints in polished boots, there was ceremony to their taking that smoothed the cruelty into benevolence. Promises of purpose, oaths that glittered like medals, and faces that spoke of a wider architecture in which my small griefs could be reclassified as necessary sacrifice. I remember the quiet of the night they left, the hush that fell over the settlement like a benediction, and the way my father's hand lingered on the gate as if to check whether the world had truly closed behind us. Obedience began as instruction. Stand when commanded, name what is given, accept the right. It deepened into identity as gene rites and implants recast my skeleton into the chapter's instrument. I remember the first incision not for pain but for the ceremony of it. The master surgeon's hand steady as a prayer, the wash of sterile light, the chorus of chanting that turned flesh into covenant, each prosthetic graft, a foreign stanza added to a hymn I was learning to sing. They told me to purge myself of longing because longing saps focus, because a brother who remembers a mother's face may falter where a wolf of the chapter must not. But there were nights in the barracks when our laughter was brittle with denial, when men caught each other's gaze and shared a memory like contraband, trading stories of small comforts like currency against the cold. They insisted it was for the greater good. Your personal attachments will cost lives in the wars to come. Your mercy will be exploited. Your hesitation will be a blade aimed at the throat of victory. And so memory was legislated. Still, how does one legislate the way a child clings to morning light? There are moments I carry with me that the chapter could not, would not forgive if they read them in my file. The time I stood at the edge of a field and watched a bird lift from the fence and felt a stab of awe that was too unmilitary to explain. The night a neighbor gave us a crust of bread and my mother's eyes filled with gratitude that I still recall as punishment against the practicalities of war. The soft, private fear in a child's chest when adults discuss sacrifice, as if it were a ledger entry rather than a life. These memories do not make me less a soldier. If anything, they are the grain of wood that keeps me from turning into brittle ceramic under the heat of duty. Yet I had to learn the performance of forgetting, the formal unmaking. It was not merely losing ties, but constructing a new self around the absence. Adopt the doctrine. Repeat the oaths until they become the shell that holds you. Let the chapter's liturgies replace lullabies. My instructors taught us to recite not only tactics but eulogies for the boy we were, and I performed those eulogies with the diligence of a man knowing his last service will be his most public. Still, memory seeks the scene. In the quiet between drills, when the world loosens its grip and the armor's whisper recedes, the boy returns to press his forehead against the inside of my skull. He does not ask for counsel or for mercy. He asks only for the dignity of being remembered without shame. He brings small things, an old coin with a dent in the edge, the smell of stew still warm with marrow, the pattern of a rainstorm that once taught me that water can wash both dirt and the trace of a man's fear. And they are ridiculous in the theater of a space marine's life. But to me, they are holy relics because they are utterly mine. There is guilt braided through these remembrances. I have been the hand that raised banners and the hand that closed the eye of a brother who fell under my command. I have followed orders that cost whole towns their mourning and accepted that cost as if it were currency paid for a larger peace. I do not repent the acts that saved comrades where I could. Repentance is the luxury of men who have not been forged into instruments of necessity. But I confess now, a slow and private thing, that every victory tasted faintly of absence, that amongst the carved honors there lingered a small vacancy where laughter once lived. The chapter taught me to call such admissions weakness, but I now prefer a different language, memory. It is not weakness to remember the small hands that held me before the harness. It is the last proof that I was ever more than ordnance. As the sarcophagus breathes the last warm exhalations of ceremonial maintenance, and the servitors settle into silence, I fold these recollections inward not to mourn what has been lost, but to honor what cannot be replaced. If the chapter's ledgers burn only with counts of wars and kill tallies, let them. I keep this softer inventory beneath my armor, a private testament that in the moment my body becomes a relic and my name is carved into cold stone, there will yet be something of the boy to warm the dark. This is not rebellion. It is a final insistence that before my sleep takes me, before the life I was shaped into snaps the thread of human tenderness, someone somewhere might remember that the making of a Marine began with squalor and a mother's patience rather than with a litany and a blade. It is a strange thing how a name dies, not with drama or ceremony, not with a priest's lament or a family's wail, but with a quiet request spoken in a cold chamber whose walls have heard the unmaking of countless boys before you. And as the sarcophagus hums with distant machine prayer, I feel again the weight of that moment. The day my name, the fragile syllables my mother whispered into my hair when thunder frightened me, was removed like a bandage, hiding a wound the chapter did not wish to see. I remember the room first, narrow, metallic, smelling faintly of antiseptics and the ghost of iron filings, illuminated by a single lumen that flickered with the indifferent rhythm of machinery older than anyone present, older perhaps than the settlement I had left behind. A chaplain stood before us, his crozius unlit, his eyes the steady burn of someone who had seen countless initiates stripped of childhood and folded into something more purposeful. I remember how he scanned each of us with a gaze both appraising and sorrowless, and how I lowered my eyes, not from fear, but from the instinctive humility of someone who understood he was about to lose something he could never reclaim. We were lined in rows, thin and awkward, our bodies not yet shaped by gene seed and discipline, each boy carrying a name that had soothed him once, shaped him once, held him once, and the chaplain asked us to speak those names aloud one final time. They left our mouths trembling, soft, confused, uttered like prayers we were not sure would be answered. Mine felt fragile as it passed my lips, as though the air itself would shred it, and when the chaplain nodded, I felt something tighten in my chest with the quiet violence of farewell. He spoke then of purpose, of legacy, of how a name rooted in mortality could not contain what we were to become. The chapter required symbols, not men, and symbols must be clean of the chaos and complication of past lives. A name, he explained, carried too much earth, too much frailty, too much memory. And so they would give us new names, names born of deeds yet to come, names that would fit the armor we must earn. I remember the murmur of compliance that rippled through the boys around me, some eager, some uncertain, some trembling like wires in a storm. But I remained silent, not out of defiance, but because I was listening to the echo of my own name as it faded from the air. They took us one by one to separate alcoves for the rite of severance. I remember the cold metal chair beneath me, the weight of the restraints not meant for punishment but for ceremony, holding my thin arms and legs in place so the gesture would be formal, controlled. A robed attendant painted my cheeks with an oil that smelled faintly of smoke and old parchment, and as the oil cooled, I felt it pulling at my skin like the fingers of ghosts tugging at the edges of memory. Then the chaplain returned, crozius still unlit, and placed a hand on my head with a gentleness that startled me. "Release it," he murmured, as though speaking to a wounded animal. "Let the boy fall away." But I did not know how. I did not know where a name went when it left the mouth for the last time. I had thought names were like scars, once made, forever part of the skin. And yet here I was, told mine must be peeled away like an old bandage. When I hesitated, the chaplain's hand firmed on my skull. "You cannot carry two lives on one spine. Let go." So I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the syllables floating from me into the dim chamber, drifting upward like ash after a fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a pulse of cold moved through the air, passing through me like a silent wave, and I felt the name loosen from some deep place behind my heart. It startled me how easy it was, how little resistance the soul gives when authority demands sacrifice. When the name left fully, I did not hear it go, but I felt the hollow it left, a small crater where something warm had been. The chaplain nodded once solemnly as though marking the moment in a ledger. And then he gave me my new name, not a word of comfort, not a syllable shaped by love or history, but a title built from the chapter's lineage, a cold, carved thing meant to fit me like armor. Hearing it was like feeling metal pressed into fresh snow, It had weight, but no warmth, no history, no echo. I repeated it, voice steady, because steadiness was expected, even admired. I repeated it again, letting it settle into my tongue like a foreign coin. And in that repetition, I felt the fracture deepen, the severing of boy from soldier, of memory from mandate. We were returned to our barracks, our new names stitched onto fresh garments, our old ones left in a silent, unseen grave behind us. Some boys whispered their old names under their breath, mourning quietly. Others embraced their new designations with the fervor of the newly converted. I did neither. I lay on my thin cot, staring at the ceiling, feeling the absence like a bruise I could not point to. In the nights that followed, instructors corrected us when we hesitated with our new names, punished lapses in identification, and praised swift assimilation. Names became tools, then symbols, then eventually truths. And the old name, the one shaped by a mother's tired voice, the one I had whispered to my sister when she slept beside me, the one my father had carved into a scrap of wood before we parted, it remained in me only as warmth, a residual heat, a fading star whose light still traveled even after the star itself had died. They believed they had erased it. They believed names could be unmade cleanly. But a name is not a word. It is a wound, a cradle, a memory of who reached for you and how you answered. And as the sarcophagus closes its first plates around my shoulders, as the machine spirit hums in steady ritual, that lost name rises again, not as rebellion, but as truth, soft and small against all this steel. They unmade the syllables, but they never unmade the boy. He lived in every hesitation, every unspoken grief, every moment I lingered on a battlefield after the killing was done. And here in the hush before I surrender to my final sleep, he lives again, reminding me that even a Marine, carved from flesh and oath, was once someone held gently, someone called by a name meant only for him. It returns to me now, not as triumph, not as shame, but as a stillness so absolute it feels carved from the marrow of who I became. The memory of the first life I ended with the clean, unflinching precision the chapter praised. And even now, as the sarcophagus seals a little tighter around my ribs and the machine spirit murmurs its low-lit lullabies, I feel that moment settle into me like a stone sinking through dark water, slow, heavy, inevitable. It was not the first time I saw death. Death walked the edges of my childhood like a stray dog, hungry and familiar, and the settlement taught us early that breath was a luxury measured by labor and luck. But to cause death, to measure the world by the removal of another's breath, that is a different arithmetic, one the chapter insisted would become instinct, an extension of our oath rather than our will. They trained us for months in the rituals of obedience before ever placing a weapon in our hands. How to breathe without trembling, how to steady the pulse until it becomes a tool rather than a traitor, how to bury hesitation in layers of doctrine until the body moves as the emperor's will rather than its own frightened calculus. We recited litanies to strip fear of its hold, and we meditated until pain became an ally, a tutor, a quiet companion. And when they finally led us to the proving grounds beneath the fortress monastery, a place so quiet even our hearts seemed to beat more softly, I believed I was ready. Belief, I learned that day, is a fragile scaffolding built by boys who do not yet understand the depth of the void they must leap into. The proving ground was dimly lit by lumen strips set into high stone arches, the air thick with the scents of oil, dust, and old oaths. Servitors rolled across the floor like silent insects, adjusting targets and recalibrating machine spirits, and the walls bore the faint scorch marks of countless trials before ours. The instructors stood at the edge of the chamber, silent, immovable pillars, watching us with the patient scrutiny of artisans observing raw material. They called my name, not the boy's name, long buried, but the new one, forged by ceremony and necessity, and handed me a blade not yet worthy of a marine, but sharp enough to divide a life if wielded with intention. The first trial was not simulated. The chapter believed that illusions only train illusions, and so they placed before us a living enemy, a prisoner taken in a border conflict, shackled, weakened, yet still burning with a hatred so fierce it felt like heat radiating off his bruised skin. His eyes found mine across the chamber, and in that gaze I saw not a monster or an abstract target or a symbol of the Imperium's foes, but a man, tired, wounded, defiant. A man who might have been a father, a brother, a friend in another life. A man whose breath fogged the cold air with the same fragile mist mine did. Something in me hesitated. The instructors watched for that hesitation the way surgeons watch for infection. I remember the prisoner's chest rising, falling, rising again. Each breath a quiet refusal to surrender to the fate he must have seen in my trembling hands. He did not beg. He did not curse. He merely held my gaze with a depth of weariness that reminded me unbearably of my father at the end of harvest cycles. And in that moment, I realized that the doctrine had not yet reached the deepest parts of me. The boy whispered that killing him would be a wound I could never erase. The soldier whispered that killing him would be the first necessary step toward becoming what the emperor demanded. Between those whispers, silence stretched, a thin, fragile membrane, and into that silence stepped the chaplain. He spoke no words. He did not raise his voice or posture with threat. He simply placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and looked at me with the kind of sorrow reserved for those who must welcome cruelty into their lives not out of malice, but out of duty. His gaze held questions I had no answer to. Do you understand what we must make of you? Do you accept the shape of the life ahead? Will you do what is necessary even when mercy claws at your throat? And then quietly he nodded. A signal, a permission, a command. I do not remember moving. I remember the breath I took, the way it tasted of metal and regret. I remember the weight of the blade as it rose, the shift of muscles trained by months of relentless drills, the moment the world narrowed to a single point where steel would meet flesh. I remember the prisoner closing his eyes, not in fear but in a strange, resigned dignity, as if he understood that my trembling was not weakness but grief. And then it happened. A single motion, clean, efficient, unhesitating. The kind of motion the chapter would carve into my record as promising. The kind of motion that made my instructors exchange silent nods of approval. The kind of motion that took something from me I have never gotten back. The man fell without ceremony, and the sound he made as he crumpled still lives in the back of my skull. Not a cry, not a gasp, but a soft exhale, as if death had been a relief he welcomed. The instructors dismissed us with praises about clarity, precision, discipline. But I lingered, staring at the cooling form on the stone floor, waiting for guilt to crush me or horror to break me. Instead, something else came, a stillness, deep and unnerving, settling like dust inside my chest. I had expected shaking. Instead, I felt only quiet, as if a door had closed inside me, sealing away the boys, trembling and leaving behind a hollow that echoed with nothing but duty. The chaplain found me later, long after the others had gone. He placed his hand on my shoulder again, but this time there was no sorrow, only acceptance. "You did not falter," he murmured. "You have taken the first step." And I knew, with a clarity that chilled me more than fear ever could, that he was right. I had not faltered. I had become what they needed. And now, centuries later, as the sarcophagus closes around me and the machine spirit hums its lullaby for warriors who will sleep until war calls them again, I allow myself to feel the tremor I denied that day, the tiny crack in the stillness, the echo of a life ended by my hand, the shadow of the boy who watched and wept in silence. It is not guilt I feel now. It is remembrance. The quiet ache of the moment, a human heart learned to kill without hesitation, and knew it would never fully come back from that threshold. There are battles whose wounds become scars, and there are battles whose wounds never close, lingering in the marrow like old, forgotten songs that rise unbidden in the dark. And as the sarcophagus tightens another measured increment around my chest, I feel the memory of him, the brother I failed, surface with a gentleness that hurts more than any blade. His face comes first, not in the stern, armor-framed severity with which he met the enemy, but in the rare quiet moments between campaigns when we sat in the dim light of the apothecarian, cleaning our weapons in companionable silence, his expression softened by the fatigue of survival, and I recall the way he hummed under his breath, a low, tuneless murmur that steadied my mind more than any litany ever had. We were bonded not by origin. Our worlds were galaxies apart, nor by shared childhood, for the chapters harvest children scattered like seeds across 1,000 dying settlements. Our bond was forged in fire, in the rhythm of fighting back to back against foes that towered like myths and crawled like nightmares. And over time, I learned his every habit, the way he cracked the knuckles of his augmetic hand before battle, the way he traced a small circle over his breastplate whenever he thought of home, the way his voice dipped by a fraction when he lied to keep my spirit steady. We were brothers in the only sense the chapter permits, and in the deeper sense the chapter never names, a chosen kinship carved from shared survival, a loyalty thicker than blood. The day I lost him did not begin with omens. It began with the mundane ritual of war, the whir of weapons cycling through diagnostic rites, the low chanting of tech servitors blessing ammunition, the scent of incense burning at the threshold of the drop pod bay. We were deployed to a world whose name I will not etch here, not out of secrecy, but because the world itself does not matter. War erases names as efficiently as the chapter erases childhood, and what remains is only the echo of the lives we carry with us. We were to cleanse a Xenos infestation burrowed deep into a ravine city carved from layers of shale and metal. The creatures were swift, cunning, and merciless, their movements skittering at the edge of sight like shadows learning to walk. I remember descending into the ravine with the others, the air thick with dust and spores that clung to the joints of our armor, and feeling that familiar shift in my brother's posture, an almost imperceptible lowering of the shoulders, the minute angle of readiness that told me he sensed something wrong. He had always possessed an instinct for danger deeper than my own, a feral awareness I trusted with the certainty of faith. When he spoke my name, my chapter name, not the one I was born with, it was with the tone of a man preparing to act faster than thought. We found the first nest half collapsed beneath a broken archway. Our squad moved in formation, disciplined and silent, bolters raised, senses sharpened. The creatures lunged from the dark in a blur of chitin and teeth, and the world dissolved into the familiar symphony of war. Bolter fire hammering through the cavern, the metallic screech of dying xenos, the pulse of adrenaline rising in the bloodstream of engineered giants. We advanced, methodical, righteous, precise. And then something went wrong. The floor beneath us collapsed in a roar of splintering shale, and we fell, controlled, practiced, landing with the heavy crash of armored titans, but separated, scattered across a lower chamber riddled with tunnels. I hit the ground hard, my armor sparking where it impacted jagged stone, and before I could regain full footing, I heard him call out, not in fear, but in warning, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the cavern like a blade. I saw him then across the chamber, standing between a swarm bursting from the tunnels and a wounded initiate who had lost the use of his legs in the fall. My brother stepped forward, placing himself as a shield without hesitation, and in that moment I recognized the geometry of sacrifice etched across his stance, the slight shift of weight that meant he had already chosen the path that would keep the novice alive at the cost of himself. I ran to him, or tried to. The swarm poured between us like a living wall, and the air filled with the percussion of bolter fire and the wet, visceral impacts of Xenos' bodies rupturing under explosive rounds. Through it all, I kept my gaze locked on him, watching the disciplined cadence of his strikes, the way he moved with the precision of a warrior who understood that every breath could be his last. I shouted his name. He heard it. He turned, not in fear, not in desperation, but in recognition, his eyes meeting mine across the chaos. And in that brief moment, I saw everything that made him more than a soldier. The fierce loyalty, the stubborn humor that had carried us through long campaigns, the quiet sorrow he carried for the things we had lost long before war took the rest. Then the world narrowed to a single point. A creature larger than the others erupted from the shadows, its form twisted with unnatural growths, its claws dripping with corrosive toxin. My brother saw it too late. It struck him with the force of a falling star, driving its talons deep into the seams of his armor, and I felt more than heard the rending of ceramite and the wet crack of bone beneath. I tore through the swarm, every step fueled by a fury so pure it burned away thought, doctrine, everything but the need to reach him. By the time I reached his side, he was on one knee, blood pooling dark and thick beneath the broken plates of his armor, his breath hissing through clenched teeth. The creature reared for the killing blow, and I ended it in a single furious strike that shattered its skull and silenced its shriek. But it was too late. I dropped to my knees beside him, the chamber lit by the flickering glow of failing lumen strips and the dying embers of bolter fire. His eyes found mine, still bright, still fiercely human despite the ruin of his body, and he reached out with a trembling hand, placing it on my forearm where the armor was still intact. "Brother," he said, voice rasping through blood and broken lungs. It was the last word he ever spoke. I held him as his breath slowed, as the light behind his eyes dimmed, as the warmth in his gauntleted hand faded. I called his name, his true name, the name the chapter had given him, the name he had earned, and I felt the cavern echo it back at me, hollow and indifferent. We recovered the survivor he saved. The chapter recorded his sacrifice with honor, carved it into stone, sang his deeds in the hall of remembrance. But none of that quieted the truth that lived in me after that day. I could save worlds, but I could not save him. And now, as the sarcophagus draws closer, sealing me into a sleep that may last centuries or a heartbeat, I feel his presence at the edge of my memory. Not accusing, not sorrowful, but steady, the way he always stood beside me in life. In the dark that gathers, I whisper his name, not the chapter name, but the private one he once murmured to me during a rare moment of unguarded kinship. And in speaking it, I feel a small piece of myself ease, as though he steps once more to my side, ready to face whatever dreams or oblivions await us. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of things unsaid, ungrieved, unresolved. And as the sarcophagus shifts around me with a low, resonant tremor, like a giant drawing a slow breath, I feel again the weight of that particular silence that followed my brother's death. A silence that stretched not for minutes or hours, but for decades, threading itself through every march, every chamber, every battle where victory rang hollow because no voice rose beside mine to answer the old familiar rhythms of companionship. We returned from that campaign with honors carved into our armor, and the young initiate he saved carried on a stretcher like a symbol of the chapter's future. But honor cannot fill the empty space at a warrior's side, and future means nothing to those whose nights remain crowded by ghosts. I remember stepping into the fortress monastery's grand hall, the echoes of our boots striking the marble floor in the rigid cadence of triumph, and feeling only the wrongness of our formation, a gap where he should have stood, a missing footstep in a rhythm I had learned by heart. The chaplain spoke the required litanies, voices rising in solemn praise, but their words washed over me like water over stone. I heard the syllables, the ritual gratitude, the declarations of faith in duty and sacrifice, yet beneath it all was a quiet I could not escape, the silence of absence, the kind of silence that follows you like a second shadow. In the days after, I performed every ritual with mechanical precision. I tended my armor, honored the machine spirit, cleaned my bolter until its metal gleamed like stagnant water beneath stormlight. I nodded when brothers offered their respects. I spoke when spoken to. I moved as the chapter required, but I did not dream. Or perhaps I did, but the dreams were blank, featureless plains of gray where sound did not travel and light did not touch anything. That silence followed me into battle after battle, across scorched moons where ash fell like snow, through ruins where civilian ghosts still hovered in the corners of burnt-out halves, over the decks of void ships where alarms wailed but meant nothing because the deeper, older silence drowned them out. It settled into the cracks left by discipline, seeped into the seams between my oaths, and grew roots in the hollow where grief had burned itself into ash. My brothers noticed in their own quiet ways. One placed a hand on my shoulder during rites and squeezed with the tentative gentleness of someone unsure whether comfort would be accepted or rejected. Another offered me his ration of recaf during a long night in the barracks where no one slept, pretending we were too disciplined for fatigue, when in truth, we were all too human for forgetfulness. A newer recruit, years later, long after my brother had passed into the chapter's archives, asked once why I kept an empty space beside me during formation. He thought it symbolic. He thought it devotional. I told him it was habit. I did not tell him it was grief. Silence, I learned, can be a companion, a sharp-edged one, a patient one. It is not hostile, but it is not kind. It merely waits. And in that waiting, it changes a man. I became more measured, more restrained. My fury, once a bright flame, cooled into something colder, denser, a force that struck not with rage but with precision honed by years of mourning. The chapter praised this evolution, calling it maturity, wisdom, a sign of spiritual alignment. They did not understand the root of it, or perhaps they did, and they accepted it the way they accept all things that make their instruments more effective. But silence does not exist in a vacuum. It echoes. It remembers. I felt it most acutely in the long marches between campaigns, those stretches of travel where centuries passed in the slow suspension of stasis. During those interludes, time itself felt like an old, tired creature circling the edges of my consciousness, waiting for me to break or speak or confess something I could never bring to the surface. The sarcophagus inside the stasis chamber was not unlike the one I lie in now. Tight, dark, humming with machinery old enough to have prayed beside saints. And in those suspended years, my mind wandered paths I never allowed when awake. I would feel him beside me again, my brother, his presence as familiar as gravity, not as a ghost or vision, but as a memory so vivid it took on weight. I would recall the way he laughed, a rare sound, low and rough-edged, usually reserved for moments when we survived something we had no right to, and sometimes in that silence I would believe I heard it, a flicker of sound, a warmth, a residue. Then the machine spirits would shift, resetting reality like a door slamming shut, and the silence would return, heavier for the brief illusion that he had been near. There were times I wondered if this silence was the Emperor's way of teaching humility, of reminding his angels of death that even they cannot escape loss. Other times I wondered if the silence was my own mind fraying, unraveling slowly under the weight of centuries lived without the people who first shaped me. But most often I simply carried it. Like armor, like memory, like the echo of a brother's last breath. Once, during a rare moment of candor with a chaplain long after I had earned my place among the chapter's veterans, I asked whether silence could be a form of penance. He regarded me for a long moment, long enough for me to wonder if I had erred by speaking at all, and then he said something I never forgot. Penance is for the guilty. Silence is for the wounded. I did not ask which I was. I did not need to. The silence answered for me. And now, as the sarcophagus seals further, as the machine spirit dims the chamber's outer sounds until the world becomes nothing but the low thrum of life support and the faint echo of my own heartbeat, I feel that old familiar presence settle in again, not as punishment, not as torment, but as truth. The truth that even in the armor of giants, even in the centuries of service, even in the unbroken line of duty etched into my bones, there is a quiet place within me shaped like the man I lost, and it is in that silence that I have remained most human. Fear is a strange thing for one such as us. We are sculpted to stand against horrors that would shatter mortal minds, engineered so that terror slides off our consciousness like water off obsidian. Yet there came a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable in its beginnings, when fear finally reached me, Not the sharp panic of battle or the instinctive recoil from some warp-born aberration, but a deep, slow-moving dread that unspooled from the center of my being. And as the sarcophagus hums around me with the pulse of ancient circuitry, I feel that moment rise again like a tide returning to shore. It came long after my brother's death, long after the silence became my companion, long after I had earned the rank of those who carry responsibility like a second spine. We were deployed to a world broken by storms that never ceased, a planet where lightning tore across the sky like the handwriting of angry gods, and the wind screamed through canyons carved from metal and bone. Our mission, like so many before it, was to hold a defensive line until reinforcements could arrive, to keep a breach sealed against creatures that poured from underground caverns with the frantic hunger of things that knew no sun. The enemy mattered only as an obstacle. It was not their presence that seeded my fear. It was something quieter, something closer. Our strike force had taken refuge in the shattered remains of an observation tower, a structure once used to monitor atmospheric patterns, but now reduced to jagged teeth of ferrocrete jutting against a boiling sky. The storm outside was relentless, fracturing the air with thunder so constant it felt like a second heartbeat pulsing beneath ours. We set up a temporary command post inside the hollow shell of the tower, and as night settled, if one can call the dimming of a lightning-choked sky night, a strange stillness crept in. Brothers moved with the habitual precision of long-honed ritual, checking ammo loads, resharpening blades, recalibrating auspex scanners that flickered under the interference. I joined them for a time, cleaning my helm with a cloth that smelled faintly of sacred oils and old smoke, but something gnawed at me, slow, insistent. Not fear, not yet, but a question forming in the dark behind my thoughts. A memory fluttered at the edges of my mind, one I had not thought of in decades. The sound of my mother's voice telling me that storms do not merely shape the sky, they shape the hearts of those who endure them. I pushed it away. There was work to do, but the storm deepened, and with it, the silence between thunderclaps grew longer, stretched thinner like a thread pulled taut. It was during one of these stretched silences that I stepped to the edge of the tower's broken balcony, looking out over the ruins below. Lightning illuminated the scorched landscape in violent flashes, momentary worlds carved in stark relief, skeletal structures, the remnants of habitation domes, the twisted carcasses of vehicles half swallowed by hardened mud. It was a dead world, a forgotten one, and staring into it, I felt something inside me falter. Not fear of the enemy, not fear of death, but fear of meaninglessness. Fear that all the centuries I had served, all the brothers I had lost, all the victories won and worlds saved, would ultimately sink into oblivion just as this world had unremembered, unhonored, unmourned. Fear that even our greatest deeds were nothing more than a thin light flickering in an ocean of dark. A chaplain approached then, recognizing something in my posture. He asked if the storm troubled me, and I almost lied. I almost told him I was recalibrating my auspex, that I was assessing terrain, anything to avoid the admission forming in my throat. But silence had taught me honesty, even if that honesty could never be spoken aloud. This world will never know we were here, I murmured. It will never know what we give. It will never know what we lose. The chaplain looked out at the ruins, his expression unreadable behind the shadowed angles of his helm. That is not our purpose, he reminded me. The Emperor sees all. But there was no comfort in that answer. Not then, not anymore. Another flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, and in that sudden white glare I saw, reflected in the warped metal plating of the far wall, my own face inside my helm. A warrior's face, a giant's, a machine of war. And for the first time, I felt the thinness of the boundary between what I was meant to be and what I used to be. I saw the faint, impossible outline of the boy I once was flicker behind the warrior's eyes. And fear bloomed. Not fear of failure, not fear of death, but fear that I had already died in ways that no sarcophagus, no apothecarian, no sacred rite could sanctify or undo. Fear that the boy had vanished so completely that only this silent, hollowed soldier remained. Fear that I had become all duty and no person. The thunder returned, crashing so loudly it felt like the tower itself shuddered under its weight. The chaplain stepped back, perhaps sensing that solitude was the only companion that could speak to me in this moment. And I stood there motionless as the storm raged around me, feeling the terrible truth settle like dust on my armor, that for all the horrors faced, all the battles survived, all the enemies slain, the thing I feared most was that I had forgotten how to be human, and that maybe the Emperor had not designed me to remember. Yet even as that fear coiled itself around my thoughts, another memory surfaced gently. The warmth of my sister's small hand, the quiet dignity of my father's weary smile, the stubborn glow of the lantern a child once raised to greet a column of passing warriors. These memories did not banish the fear, but they softened it, humanized it, reminded me that fear was proof of something still living inside the armor, something the chapter had tried to strip away, something that had survived anyway. Now, as the sarcophagus seals further, enclosing me in the dark that will cradle my long sleep, I let that fear settle beside me, not as an enemy, but as a truth. Fear means the boy is still there, and if the boy remains, then perhaps, just perhaps, I am not yet lost to the silence that has followed me across centuries. Dreams are forbidden to us. Not by decree. No chaplain stands over a resting Marine with a censer and a warning, but by design, by the cold efficiency of gene craft and discipline that builds walls inside the mind so tall and seamless that nothing soft, nothing wandering, nothing truly human may climb them. And yet, as the sarcophagus tightens another measured degree around my limbs and the machine spirit settles into its slow, reverent hum, I feel again the single dream that breached those walls, the dream I was never meant to have, the dream that arrived quietly in the long dark between campaigns like a trespasser slipping through a locked door. It happened during a century-long voyage through the void. We were held in stasis aboard a strike cruiser so old its hull bore the scars of wars fought before my chapter had a name, drifting through warp currents that moaned against the vessel's bones. Stasis is not sleep. It is a suspension, a halting of the self, a dimming of thought until identity becomes something small, lightless, preserved like an ember waiting for breath. In that suspension, there should be no dreaming, no drifting, no memory, only the cold mathematics of survival. But somewhere in the folds of that frozen eternity, something stirred. Something slipped between the slow pulses of the stasis field and found me. At first, it was only warmth, a faint glow at the edges of the dark, like the first hesitant flicker of a candle cupped between trembling hands. Warmth was alien to that place. Stasis is cold, absolute, unyielding. Yet there it was, spreading through the hollow places within me, thawing things I had long accepted as frozen. Then came sound, a small sound. Familiar, impossible. The soft tapping of rain on metal roofing. The sound of storms from my childhood settlement, storms that held no hatred, no poison, no tactical significance, only the rhythm of living under a fragile roof in a fragile world. The sound grew clearer, closer, until I felt it not with my ears. Stasis permits no such illusions, but with memory itself, as though the dream were carving open the sealed vault of my past. And then I saw her, my sister. The girl whose face I had almost forgotten, who lived in my memory only as a shape, a warmth, a ghost of laughter. But here in this forbidden dream she was clear, terrifyingly clear, kneeling beside a shallow metal basin filled with rainwater, her small hands cupped as if catching the sky itself, her hair plastered to her forehead, soaked through. Her smile wide, bright, triumphantly human, shining against a world that offered her so little. "Look," she said. I heard the word. I should not have been able to. "Look, this one's for you." She lifted her hands, letting droplets fall back into the basin like tiny, fragile stars returning to the void. I felt something break under my breastbone, something old. Something I had stepped away from the day my childhood name was taken. She beckoned me closer, her eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of a child who has discovered something wondrous and needs someone she loves to witness it. I tried to step forward, though I had no body in that place, only will, only longing. And when I reached her, she placed her hand against my cheek. That warmth, that unbearable, gentle warmth, cut deeper than any blade. It was the hand of someone who had loved me without ceremony, without expectation, without oath. The hand of someone I had not protected, someone I had abandoned to the hunger of the galaxy. "Please." I heard myself say, not in the voice of a space marine, but in the thin, fragile voice of a boy. "Please don't go." Her expression softened. The dream darkened at its edges like paper catching fire. "You already left," she whispered. "I just came to give it back." "Give what back?" I asked, though dread curled tight in my core. "Your name." And in her cupped hands, small, trembling, impossibly bright, lay a single syllable. The syllable of my birth name, the last piece of me not forged by the chapter. The piece I thought long dissolved into the marrow of a warrior's duty. Hearing it, truly hearing it, was like being pierced by light. It was everything I had lost, everything I had buried, everything I had forced myself to unlearn for the sake of becoming more than human, more than mortal, more than myself. And I wanted it. Emperor, forgive me, I wanted it. I reached for her hands, reached for that fragile offering. But as my fingers brushed the glowing edge of the syllable, the dream shattered. Not gently, not slowly. It tore apart with the violence of a dying star, ripping warmth and color and childhood into ribbons of light that dissolved into the void. I woke from stasis screaming, not aloud, for my body was still held in the machine's grip, but inside the vault of my mind where no sound could escape. It took weeks to steady myself as the voyage ended, though no one knew. A space marine is always disciplined, always composed, always obedient. But inside, something remained divided. The dream had opened a door. It had shown me a truth I had not been meant to remember, that I could still be reached. That something human still lived beneath the armor. That despite centuries of war, loss, indoctrination, and duty, my soul had not fully surrendered to the machine of the Imperium. Now, as the sarcophagus draws tighter and the last lights fade from the chamber, I think of her hand against my cheek, the warmth of it, the impossibility of it. I think of the syllable she tried to give back. And I wonder, not with fear but with a strange, quiet longing, whether the dream was a trespass or a gift. There are victories so devastating they feel indistinguishable from defeat, and as the sarcophagus closes further, its clamps whispering like old monks finishing a prayer, I feel the memory of that final battle rise with the weight of a world behind it, the battle that took far more than my flesh, the battle that carved out the last unbroken pieces of me and left them scattered in the dust of a nameless plain where even the sky seemed tired of watching war. It began, as so many endings do, without glory, a broken distress signal from a frontier world barely mapped in the chapter's archives, a fractured cry swallowed by static and carried on the aftertaste of warp interference. Reinforcements were days away. My squad arrived alone. We dropped into a war zone already half dead, the structures torn open like rib caves, the air thick with smoke and despair, the soil churned into gray sludge by the weight of too many bodies, human and otherwise. Whatever had struck this world had struck with precision and cruelty, leaving behind not the frenzy of a chaotic assault, but the cold, methodical devastation of a predator that understood anatomy. We moved through the ruins with bolters ready and hearts steady, though each of us felt it, the tightening in the air, the sensation that the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would break first. As dusk draped itself across the sky like a dying thing, they emerged. Xenos bred for slaughter, swift as shadows, silent as guilt, moving with a cohesion that suggested calculation rather than instinct. And our battle, when it began, was not a clash of titans but the slow unraveling of inevitability. One by one, the squad faltered, not through error but through attrition. War is a patient executioner. I remember each brother who fell, though their names have since blurred into a single ache, the weight of their last breaths heavy in the recycled air of my helm, the hollow thud of armored bodies collapsing onto the ruined ground. Their deaths were clean, efficient, devoid of drama. Heroes seldom die with fanfare. Most die quietly, like candles snuffed by an indifferent wind. By the time night fully claimed the battlefield, only two of us remained, myself and a young brother newly ascended from the trials, his armor still bearing the sheen of youth, his eyes burning with the stubborn fire of one who has not yet learned how cold the galaxy can be. He fought with a courage that stung me with memories of my brother long lost. And because of that, because of the echo of a life I had failed to protect, I made a choice in that moment that would haunt me long after the battle ended. When the largest of the Xenos tore through the crumbling wall of a shattered manufactorum and lunged for the young warrior, I intercepted its blow, taking its full strength across my left flank. I felt the armor buckle, felt ribs crack, felt the world tilt sideways under the impact. Pain blossomed through my chest like fire swallowing old timber, but I held the line, planting my boots in the mud as though anchoring myself to something deeper than duty. "Run," I told him. It was not a command. It was a plea. He hesitated, loyalty warring with fear, but the second wave of creatures answered for him as they swarmed through the broken corridor. He ran not out of cowardice, but out of obedience to a truth all warriors eventually learn: that survival is sometimes the final service you can offer your fallen. Alone, I fought until the world narrowed to a tunnel of flickering red runes inside my helm, each warning pulse a countdown toward the end of my borrowed time. I could no longer feel the left side of my body. My breaths grew ragged, wet, each inhale a reminder that something vital had been punctured. But I continued, not for victory, victory had fled hours ago, but for the stubborn, ancient instinct that had lived inside me since childhood, to protect, even when protection is a losing battle. I killed the last of them just as dawn crept into the sky, pale and exhausted, painting the ruins with a fragile, indifferent light. I remember sinking to one knee, the battle finally over, the silence settling across the plain like a shroud. I thought of my sister catching rainwater in a basin. I thought of my brother dying with his hand on my arm. I thought of the boy I once was, whispering his name into the dark. And then my vision blurred. I collapsed fully, my body no longer capable of supporting the weight of centuries. Reinforcements arrived hours later. They found me half buried in the mud, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, enemy and brother alike. I was alive, but only in the way a candle is still alive when it has burned down to a trembling wick. The apothecaries worked quickly, efficiently, reverently, but even they could not deny the truth written in the ruin of my body. Too much had been lost, too much had been carved away, too much had been taken by duty, by fate, by the knife edge of battle after battle. I was a warrior with no body left to carry his war, and so they brought me here, to the sarcophagus, to the waiting metal womb where the remnants of my life would be folded into machinery and sealed beneath layers of prayer and steel. The final battle did not kill me. It simply ended the part of me that could walk beneath the sky as a man. It took from me not only flesh, not only bone, but the illusion that I could remain untouched by the endless toll of service. And yet, lying here now, as the sarcophagus seals around me like the closing of a long-forgotten book, I feel no bitterness, no anger, no regret, only an echo, soft, persistent, of the dream I was never meant to have. My sister's hand warm against my cheek, the syllable of my true name glowing in her palms. A reminder that even as war took everything, something still remained. Something that could not be carved away. Something the final battle could not claim. There is a quiet that comes at the end of all things, not the silence of death, nor the dreadful hush before a battle's first shot, but a gentler quiet, like the breath a world takes just before dawn. And as the sarcophagus seals the final plates around my broken form, locking me into the cradle where I will spend the rest of my unnatural life, I feel that quiet settle into me with the weight of both an ending and a release. The chamber beyond my coffin fades, its sounds dimming into the steady thrum of machine prayers and the soft ticking of cooling armor. And for the first time in centuries, I do not reach for duty or doctrine or the next war waiting beyond the horizon, but instead let my mind drift, not forward, but inward, toward the fragments of the life I have carried like contraband beneath my armor. The memories I was told to abandon, but which clung to me with the persistence of roots seeking water in stone. I feel the warmth of the sarcophagus as its spirit stirs, ancient and watchful, assessing the ruin of my body with the detachment of a caretaker who has seen too many warriors enter its embrace. It reads the scars carved into me by blade and claw and flame, the fractures that never fully healed, the hollow spaces where organs once lived, the long tapestry of injuries accumulated across centuries of violence, and it accepts them without judgment, for it was built to hold the fallen, not to question how they fell. My breathing slows, each inhale a negotiation between flesh and machine, each exhale a surrender. I am not afraid, not anymore. The fears that once stalked me, the fear of forgetting, the fear of becoming only a weapon, the fear that my humanity had been carved away too early, too efficiently. Those fears feel softer now, as though distance has turned them into old stories whispered through fog. In their place rises something older, something gentler, remembrance. I remember the dream of my sister offering me my lost name, the syllable glowing like a star cupped in her hands. I remember the quiet pride in my father's voice when he taught me to mend a broken hinge rather than discard it. I remember the storm-washed scent of my settlement's rooftops, the creak of rusted pipes, the warmth of stew shared after long work, the echo of a child's laugh threading through the dust-choked air like a note from an instrument too fragile for war. I remember my brother, the one I could not save, his hand heavy on my arm, his eyes steady even as life fled them. I remember the battles that tested my faith, the silences that followed me like shadows, the centuries where I feared the boy inside me had been lost. And then, quietly, I realized something I had never dared to admit. The boy was never lost. He was simply waiting for the war to pause long enough for me to hear him whisper again through the cracks in the armor. Waiting for the moment when everything else fell away, titles, honors, ranks, kills, campaigns, and only truth remained. The sarcophagus clamps finished their sacred descent, locking my arms into their resting channels, aligning my spine against conduits older than the history of my chapter. And I feel the machine spirit brush against the edges of my consciousness like a soft, metallic tide. It does not demand. It does not command. It simply waits for me to let go. My heartbeat slows further, each pulse sinking deeper into the rhythm of the sarcophagus, until it feels no longer like my heart, but like the heart of something larger holding me. In this quiet, memories drift through me like constellations rearranging themselves. The dream of rain on a tin roof, the glow of a child's lantern, the weight of my first blade, the warmth of comradeship, the ache of loss, the soft miracle of still being able to feel sorrow. And then I understand, truly understand, that devotion, for all its demands, was never meant to be a cage. It became one only when I feared the cost of remembering who I had been. But here, in the final moment before sleep, I allow devotion to become something gentler, a thread binding all my lives together, the boy and the warrior, the broken and the whole, the lost and the remembered. I breathe out one last time, the exhale long and slow, and in that breath I release every fragment of fear that ever hollowed me. The sarcophagus closes the final seal, locking me into the darkness with a solemn, almost tender finality. The world beyond fades. The machine spirit murmurs a lullaby older than I am. My vision dims into the soft glow of internal sensors shifting to standby. And in that deepening dark, something remarkable happens. I hear my name. Not the chapter name carved into records long after I was reshaped. Not the honorifics earned from battles and victories. But the small, fragile human name given to me by a tired mother in a forgotten settlement under a cracked metal roof. The name I thought gone. The name my sister once held out to me in a dream. It echoes through the quiet of my mind like a lantern flickering in an endless night. I do not reach for it. I do not cling to it. I simply let it be. A final truth. A final mercy. A final light. As the sarcophagus draws me into my long sleep, whether for centuries or until war calls me forth again. I carry that light with me, held not in hands but in the quiet center of my being, a warmth no darkness can extinguish. And with a peace I have not felt since childhood, I let the last thought drift from me like a whispered prayer. I remember.